40,000 of the faithful had come to support a general strike called by the main Islamic opposition party, the Front Islamique du Salut, or FIS. It was to mark the beginning of a series of mass demonstrations which finally provoked the military clampdown. The fundamentalists had swept the board in last year's local elections, and they were outraged that the government had now rigged the ballot to cheat them out of victory in the upcoming national elections. They demanded a change in the rules and the president's resignation. Their leader is the paternal figure of Abbassi Madani. But perhaps their favourite is his deputy, the great orator Ali Belhadj. He doesn't just quote from the Quran. The crowd love him for his scathing attacks on the corruption of one-party government and for his vision of an Islamic utopia. This, then, is the genie the Algerian authorities tried to bottle up in the weeks before the general election.
Between 1962 and 1977, Algeria saw its population grow exponentially while the economy was slowly tanking. The ability to supply jobs, housing, food, and urban infrastructure was incomplete, while Algeria itself was run by a single party ostensibly based on socialism, anti-imperialism, and popular democracy. However, it was ruled by a high-level military. Corruption was widespread, and the people became more desperate. Chadli Bendjedid, who became the third president of Algeria, was considered a reformer, one who reduced the state's role in the economy and eased government surveillance of citizens. However, tensions arose between elements of the regime who supported Bendjedid, economic liberalization policies, those who wanted to return to the status mode. The Islamists of the country took immediate notice. The start of the nationalist bloc began with Boumediene's foreign policy decisions in the early 1950s, with most of the FNL-FLN maintaining good relations with both the communist bloc and the capitalist nations, while promoting third world cooperation. After the Evian Accords, which saw the country dissolve into a one-party system, the structure of government became more insular and also without threat of opposition. In 1978, Boumediene passed away. This led to the country to find a successor, one in which was colonel of the Algerian People's National Army, a relative unknown but respected among his commanders. The only problem was Boumediene was not as strict as his previous administration with the religious sector. This minor flaw would have resounding consequences later on. Chadli Bendjedid was not as harsh as his predecessor was against the religious sector. Despite the new liberal reforms under Bendjedid, the people wanted change, and with the influence of the local mosques, members in the south, they would witness a change, not for the better, but for the worse. Bendjedid was deeply resented by the Algerian youth and its embittered religious minority. The National Liberation Front, or FLN, was the predominant party, led by nationalist idealists such as Bendjedid and former president Houari Boumediene. However, Boumediene was forming Algeria into a more dedicated government infused with westernized society and away from its more traditional religious background. However, the economic strife, foreigners in the country began to live more fluidly and profited off their expertise. The Algerians were beginning to take heed of the warning signs, which saw them becoming dismissed from their own very government. On February 5th of 1988, the riots began as a boiling pot. Fervent dissidents such as Abdelhak Layela and Abdelkader Chedbouti, both men serving in the government's private sectors and military, In the northern hills of the country, the imams would invoke the youth to rise up against the corruption shown to its citizenry. The riots began in the nation's capital, Algiers. Thousands of vigorous young men and even women began the most aggressive protests since the country's independence in 1962 from the French. The protests then turned into riots against the Algerian military. Police and civil administration were put under military control immediately. The protests were marred with insults toward the police. Many of the Algerians taunted them as they policed curfews in the relatively quiet towns. As they passed, they were called Jews in reference to the Intifada in Israel. One of the more polarizing antagonists in the riots was Ali Belhadj, an imam who was born in Tunisia, became the imam at the Al Sunnah Mosque in Bab el Goued, a district in Algiers. The riots would slowly die down. Bendjedid took action and reformed the country's constitution. The riots led to the constitution being amended to allow a multi-party system. And on June 12, 1990, the first election held since Algeria's independence would witness Bendjedid's party, the National Liberation Front, challenge the Islamic Salvation Front, or the FIS. The FIS were a political party run by two men, Abbassi Madani, a local businessman, and Ali Belhadj, an Islamic activist. When the elections were over and the votes were casted in, the FIS had completely shocked the Algerian government by winning the election and gaining the majority of the seats. The FIS party had won with 54% of the votes, almost double that of the FLN, and far more than any other parties involved. The results would not only stun the National Liberation Front, but also the country as a whole, as well as the outside world watching its history unfold. The majority of the citizenry wished for a new form of government, one that would be led by not only Ali Belhadj, but also from Abbassi Madani, a political careerist and also a one-time member of the FLN. Both men would form the Armed Islamic Front. The final results were unanimous, the FIS winning by a landslide, and almost immediately, the FIS began implementing its goals for Sharia law as outlined by both of its founders, Belhadj and Madani. The finite goal for Algeria, an absolute Islamic state. One of the goals of its fiercely devout religious imam, Belhadj, was to finally oust the cause of economic disparity in the country by banning all French residents of Algeria from the country. Before its national radio, Ali Belhadj declared, "My intention to ban France from Algeria intellectually and ideologically and be done once and for all with those whom France has nursed with her poisoned milk." Activists started their expungement of anything that was considered haram, which included satellite dishes, which received European broadcasting. This was changed to Arab broadcasting. Books and magazines that were not Arab-oriented were also banned. All women were required to wear a full veil, along with the Arabization of the educational system. However, when the Algerian army saw what was taking place, they decided to revolt against the FIS. On January 11, 1992, the army forced President Chadli Bendjedid to resign, bringing in the exiled independence fighter Houari Boumediene to serve as a new president. It began a harsh crackdown on those with the FIS and deterred them into the Sahara Desert. Many in the FIS were arrested, over 7,000 members. In 1992, those who were considered too militant took to the mountains of northern Algeria. The FIS wanted to change the entire country's narrative towards an Islamic one, where anything else was considered haram, which is sinful, or prohibited. The FLN took immediate action. Later in the year, after peaceful and productive protests, the Algerian military, under orders from Boumediene, arrested FIS President Abbassi Madani, who was arrested and jailed on charges of threatening state security. Ali Belhadj would also be arrested shortly thereafter, condemning the actions of the Algerian military, in which he said, "There is no democracy in Islam, and if people vote against the law of God, this is nothing other than blasphemy. The ulema will order the death of the offenders who have substituted their authority for that of God." The FIS had dissolved, however, when other more aggressive militant groups began taking part in the crackdowns. One of those groups, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, the GSPC, took part in numerous atrocities later on. Thus, the civil war would begin again. The insurgents began taking the hills and mountainous regions along with rural districts. Some militant groups engaged in banditry, others settling scores with the patriots, or others, some enlisting in the services of landowners to frighten illegal occupants away. Abdel Qadir Chebuti, a long-standing Islamist who once served in the military, created an Islamic army and called it the Islamic Armed Movement, or the MIA. On January 11, 1992, the Algerian military canceled the electoral process and forced Bendjedid to resign, in turn bringing in the exiled praetor Boudouif. However, and shortly after, on June 25, 1992, Boudouif was assassinated by an FIS party member. Many in the FIS were arrested and jailed, which led to more civil unrest in the northern parts of the country. By 1993, many in the fields of science, education were assassinated by members of the FIS who saw them as French occupiers. The atmosphere for violence saw a rapid increase toward the extremes as the Algerian airport was bombed and many people were beheaded for being an associate of the nationalist part of the FLN. Many insurgent groups began to form. Others, such as the MIA, were continuing their atrocities toward people who were considered either French or part of the nationalist movement. Abdel Qadir Chebuti was a devout Islamist and would lead the charge in many of these atrocities. The acts of violence was beginning to spread, and the FLN waged its war against the FIS and other Islamist insurgent groups. On September 11, 1999, Abdelaziz Bouteflika was elected president. The FIS was losing its strength under the constant barrage of the army and losing its popularity amongst the people. Soon after his election, he began contrasting the Islamist groups. With Madani and Belhadj already in jail, the new leadership began the exodus of militants returning to normal life. And on January of 2000, many Islamic fighters were given amnesty. And in just 2 short years later, the civil war would finally come to an end. The Algerian army would be responsible for the clear defeat of radical Islamism, which also would be one of the few Arab countries that would not witness an Arab Spring.